platforms, not only with his work of founding CEEW, but also on the variety of different both government of India and international panels that he's part of. He represents India at the topmost levels in the COP discussions. And so he has an insight not only into global thought on this place, but is an actual thought provoker. And he's someone who takes action and develops global opinion around what may be India's position, as well as what may be the current thought that we take forward. So, ladies and gentlemen, sustainability is an area which is of deep concern to everyone. And increasingly, we feel that it is not given enough appreciation in India because we feel that our net zero targets may be 50 years out in 2070. But the action has to happen now. We need to understand the consequences of climate change, how it will impact each and every one of us. But more than that, how is this change really going to happen? What is the economics? What are the technologies? What are the policies that we need to incorporate? What are the changes that we as individuals will need to make in our practices and businesses in terms of how carbon markets may evolve, or a variety of different factors? So Arunabha will hopefully take us through a variety of different areas. We may not be able to cover all of it because of the paucity of time. I would like to start first with Arunabha giving an introductory remark, following which we will open it up. I will ask him some questions before we open it up to the audience. I request the audience to write their questions on the chat box. I know that we will not be able to get to most of them, but hopefully I will pass the questions on to Arunabha so that he may get an idea of what concerns and comments that people have, so that he is aware of them. But having said that, ladies and gentlemen, sustainability is an area, and climate change is an area which impacts every one of us. We know the volatility in precipitation and other factors that are the consequence of climate change. We have the data is quite clear, as I believe from the International Energy Agency, that approximately 50% of end energy consumption is in the form of heating and cooling. This may be in the form of both industrial heating and cooling, but also residential and institutional heating and cooling. What does that mean for India in terms of its energy requirement going forward? Have we made a specific budget or a transition map for our requirements in terms of how we will actually consume energy? But more than that is also the fact that we tend to look at energy only from the perspective of electricity and power, while our consumption is so much more. It is in terms of fuel for transportation. It is in terms of a variety of different forms that we do consume energy. So it always troubles me that we have a Ministry of Renewable Energy, Ministry of Power, Ministry of Coal, a Ministry of Steel, etc., which all have energy as an underlying theme, but we don't have one consistent thought around it. So Arunabha, hopefully we could use you and your offices and CEEW to maybe push an energy budget and push a super ministry for energy, which may be necessary for us to get through this transition. So ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to first pass it over to Arunabha and then take it through the rest of the discussion before we take some question and answers. So over to you, Arunabha.
Yeah. Thank you, Nikhil. Can you hear me?
Yes, very audible.
Terrific. Thank you so much to you and to AIMA for inviting me to engage in this discussion. I'm looking forward to it. I will maybe present for about 20 odd minutes. Is that okay? And then we can have the dialogue between you and me and open it up for questions. If you could just let me know that you can see my presentation.
Yes, we can see the presentation.
Perfect.
Will you make the presentation available to people?
Sorry?
Will this presentation be available to
yes,
people?
we can. We'll put it up on our website so you can get it. Yes, yeah. In fact, that's a good question because there will be a lot of information and data in there, and I will intentionally skip through some of the slides, more to indicate the kind of issues that I want to introduce in your minds. And we can come back to those slides if there is interest. But really, what I'm trying to present to all of you is how do we balance growth with sustainability? The traditional approach towards economic development and and sustainability was a linear one. You went from agriculture to industry to services. You dirtied the water and you polluted the air and you degraded the land, and then you got rich and then you started cleaning things up. That option doesn't exist anymore for us. And I'll explain why from the point of view of science, but also why from the point of view of where business and technology and finance is headed. And it's important that Indian industry begins to tap into this opportunity in a strategic way, not just in a reactive way, but in a much more thought through, proactive manner. As a way of introduction, I represent the Council on Energy, Environment and Water. It is a 14-year-old institution which I founded in August of 2010. In the last 14 years, we've been ranked among the 20 best climate think tanks in the world. Our work focuses on system-level transformations, as you can see, from modeling the low-carbon economy, the energy transitions, power markets, industrial sustainability, and so forth, but also focusing on the quality of life of citizens, the air we breathe, the water we drink, the food we eat, as Nikhil was saying, how we cool ourselves in a hot country, and how we move. To make any of this happen, we need the enablers. We need the enablers of finance. We need technology. We need a new paradigm of circular economy. We need to be much more resilient against climate shocks. And of course, we need cooperation within and outside the country. So with a team of over 300 people, we are deeply invested in the data and the analysis that we conduct. And I will be drawing on all of that to present some ideas to you. So why net zero? Let's start with that. Why is it this is an important issue? Because we keep hearing this phrase, but we haven't all internalized it. Net zero is not just about the energy transition. It is actually about the economy. So let's first start by recognizing where India sits. We are likely to emerge as the third largest economy in GDP terms, not just purchasing power parity terms, by 2030, driven by a year-on-year growth rate of, say, between 6 and 7%, far faster than the other major economic regions that we have, which are obviously richer, but this is India's decade, hopefully now and beyond. Of course, we have to do this both with a conscious focus on economic growth, but also asking ourselves what kind of economic growth. This is why we have to recognize that just at the moment, which is our takeoff time, we are in a critical time frame to address a planetary emergency. There is not just climate, there is 9 planetary boundaries that are at the threat of being breached or have been breached. These are basically the impacts of human activities on the Earth system that beyond a certain tipping point, the environment is unable to self-regulate. 6 of those 9 planetary boundaries, whether it is climate, whether it's novel entities, whether it is biogeochemical flows, freshwater change, land system change, have all been breached already. And if we look at only climate, and if we take that value of 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels as beyond which catastrophic things begin to happen, we have only the remainder of this decade to prevent that climate overshoot. Currently, the world is on track for well over 2 degrees Celsius of warming. Now, this is also cause for emergency because just when India and other emerging markets have to grow, the developed world has not yet yielded that remaining carbon space. Developed countries themselves will overshoot their own climate targets of 2030 by 38%. And that means they will collectively emit another 3.7 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent in that year. The remaining carbon budget of about 500 billion tons will be depleted by 2030 or before 2030. One of the issues that keeps coming up is coal. Just a few weeks ago, the G7, the developed countries group, came out with a plan to phase out coal by 2035. But actually, originally, they were supposed to phase out earlier. So we did some calculations and we found that just by shifting that phase-out date from, say, 2030 to 2035, they will end up emitting another 3.2 billion tons of carbon. That's more than our annual gross GHG emissions. So this is the challenge. We've got a pizza pie that has been almost eaten up. We are breaching these planetary boundaries, but at the same time, we don't have equitable access to the remaining carbon space. Now, we can complain about this, of course, in climate negotiations, but we have to recognize that it's our vulnerability because of which this matters to us. At CEEW, we are developing the first high-resolution climate resilience atlas for India at a district and a sub-district level. It is perhaps the first or one of the first of its kind anywhere in the developing world. What we know only by looking at the past 50 years, is that now 3/4 of our districts are hotspots for extreme climate events, such as floods, droughts, cyclones, and in some cases, floods and droughts, floods and cyclones, droughts and cyclones, and so forth. And 80% of Indians are residing in districts that are highly vulnerable to extreme hydrometeorological disasters. I'm speaking to you right now from Mumbai, where, as you know, just a week ago, very heavy rains. What happened to the flooding? We've seen this in other places, in Bangalore last year, in Delhi in recent weeks, etc. And at the same time, you have water crises. This is not the usual problem. The challenge is that the trends are changing. So this other map comes from something we released, again, as part of the Climate Resilience Atlas just a few months ago. This is the first sub-district, tehsil level precipitation analysis. And we see that 23% of Indian districts are now witnessing high number of deficient as well as excessive rainfall years. Means there'll be periods of almost no rain, and then suddenly there'll be periods of very heavy, intense rainfall. 64% of our about 4,700 tehsils have witnessed an increase in the frequency of heavy rainfall days by 1 to 15 days per year for the southwest monsoon. And 48% of the tehsils saw an increased rainfall in October for the winter rains by more than 10%. So the past is no longer a predictor of the future. We are heading into uncertain territory, and we're heading into what I call the period of non-linearity, that there is no longer a linear trend to what we are saying, but there are shocks and flips in the curves that we will see, whether it is for extreme events or other associated consequences. So looking behind then, if we understand that we are both a very rapidly growing economy and a very climate vulnerable economy, we have to look behind where are our emissions coming from before we figure out how to then begin to abate them. So again, at CEEW, along with some other institutions, we developed an independent inventory of India's emissions called the GHG Platform India. As you can see, between 2005 and 2018, the latest years for which for all sectors we have comparable data, overall, India saw an 86% rise in CO2 emissions during this period. But bulk of that, 83% of those emissions are coming from the energy sector. And within the energy, there's electricity generation, there's residential usage, there's transport, there's fuel production, there's industries, etc. And then we also see a 50% or more than 50% increase in industrial emissions, which account for overall about 7% of India's GHG emissions. Again, bulk of that coming from very heavy industries like iron and steel, cement, aluminium, and chemicals. For transport also, we see a very rapid rise over the last 2 decades of emissions, both on the passenger transport side, the graphic on the left, as well as on the freight transport side, the graphic on the right. And all of this is consistent with a very rapidly growing economy, not just over the past decade. We can extrapolate this into the future. But as a consequence, our quality of life is also degrading, as is our economy. We, of course, suffer air pollution severely in Delhi. But this is not just a Delhi or North India-centric problem. Over the last 20 years, we've had a 28% increase in population, nearly 500% increase in GDP, but also a 17% increase in the finest particulate matter concentrations, which is impacting not just our health, but our economy. In fact, it was a study done by CII and Dalberg that estimated that India is losing about 7 lakh crore every financial year to air pollution related consequences. 42 of 50 of the world's most polluted cities are in India. It's 17% of the national disease burden. It impacts productivity of factory employees and others by a non-trivial share. It even decreases the production of renewable energy when air pollution reduces the solar panels' productivity. So air pollution is not something separate that we deal with. Let's grow first, let's get rich, and then let's clean up the air. It is directly linked to our economic prospects right now. And we can see this is coming from various different sources. In Delhi, the bulk of it is actually from transport. It is not crop burning. The biomass burning is concentrated in a couple of months in the year. But over the course of the year, it's actually primary transport. In central and western states, it's primarily coal-fired thermal power plants. In northeastern states, it's waste burning, etc. So we need a scientific approach towards dealing with something that's holding our economy and our health back. So how do we then look ahead to reduce our emissions? Of course, Prime Minister Modi articulated this in the form of what he called the Panchamrit, the 5 nectars, in his speech in Glasgow. One was that we reduce the emissions intensity, means the amount of emissions that comes out for each additional unit of GDP that we produce, and that we reduce it by 45% by 2030 against 2005 levels. By our calculations, by 2019, at the beginning of this decade, we had, or the end of the last decade, we had reduced it by 33%. The other is building clean electricity capacity. So the promise is that 50% of our electricity power capacity will come from non-fossil sources. In fact, just a few weeks ago, for the first time, the share of coal-based power capacity, not generation, has fallen below 50%. Right now, the non-fossil capacity is at 45.5%. There's an absolute number associated with this, which is that by 2030, 500 gigawatts of non-fossil power generation capacity will be built out. Let's put this in context. When we began operations at CEEW in 2010, the same year when our solar mission began in India, we had less than 20 megawatts of solar. We had a little more of wind, we had some hydro, etc. Now this rapid growth in renewables, and I'll talk about that in a second, has resulted in 203 gigawatts of non-fossil electricity capacity, making us the 4th largest renewables market in the world. But it's not, as Nikhil rightly says, not just about electricity. It's about energy use overall. And therefore, net zero means that we bend the emissions curve for all sectors down to close to zero, and what we can't, that we compensate for by either absorbing it from forestry or figuring out other technologies to suck carbon out of the air and so forth. Which is why I say this is a call for economic transformation. And one of the things that India has introduced into the discourse is that this is also about lifestyles. One study that we did at CEEW last year showed that the average footprint of developed countries is still higher than the footprint of the richest 10% of the population in developing countries like India or Brazil, etc. That does not give us an excuse to have a high emissions lifestyle ourselves. But we have to then look at lifestyles also as a way of driving a very different kind of economic growth, not about limiting growth, but about driving circular economy of resource recycling, etc. Now, Here is how we see the overall energy sector, not just electricity, as Nikhil nudged us to, how we can get to net zero. So this is coming from CEEW's net zero model. And basically, we see that until about 2040, we will still see a growth in the primary energy demand that will be serviced from fossil fuels, primarily coal. You can see that upward sloping curve up to 2040. And then it begins to bend down. So that moment of bending down is important because it's called the peaking year. Now, between 2040 and 2070, that 30-year period will be, if we succeeded, would be the fastest rate of shifting from peaking to net zero for any major economy. To give an example, the US and Japan peaked their emissions in the 2000s. So they are taking more than 40 years to get there. China is taking about 35 years to get there. The EU is taking well over 70 years to get there. So right now for India's economy, all energy vectors will have to grow, even as the growth rates of the clean energy vectors have to be faster than that of the fossil. Now, this then has implications for specific sectors. So let's take industry and transport, because it's not just about electricity generation. It's the electricity generation and then use. One of the main things we have to do is massively electrify the economy and then massively make sure that that electricity becomes cleaner. So in massively electrifying the economy, we see from our model that from very low shares of electricity in our transport sector now, as you know, as liquid fuels, it goes up to about nearly 80% of the transport energy has to come from electricity. The remaining about 20% comes from hydrogen. The same we see in industry. A lot of our small, medium enterprises are using dirty fuels. They can be converted to electricity, and that electricity can be cleaner. So again, for a bulk of the industrial sector, it's the electrification of the industrial sector, which is the story, upwards of 70 to 75%. And the remainder then comes from the hydrogen uptake for the very heavy industries. So how is India going to make any of this happen? There are many routes to this. The first, of course, is energy efficiency as the first fuel, right? Whatever you don't need is better than consuming energy of any form that you do need. So if you can reduce the energy need, that's the first thing. And India has been doing it in different ways. I'll rush through these. You probably know about some of this already. The huge push towards energy efficient lighting through the LED light bulbs program. Now there is an interest in doing similar things with cooling, looking at super efficient air conditioners, looking at super efficient ceiling fans. That alone, our estimation, is a $20 billion market, incidentally. But also now the infrastructure that is needed for energy efficiency at the household level. So this rollout of hundreds of millions of over 200 million smart meters that are going to be installed in Indian homes then allows for bidirectional communication of the electrons so that you can optimize the appliance usage, energy storage, trade it in a peer-to-peer trading platform, and so forth. In a way, we can create a power market of the future that we haven't yet imagined fully. The second route is, of course, the renewable story. And I've already talked to you about this, how we went from very low levels of solar and wind at the beginning of the last decade to becoming now the fourth largest renewable energy capacity installed globally. A nearly 400% increase in RE capacity over the last 10 years. But renewables are of different kinds. When we often imagine renewables, we imagine big solar plants in Gujarat or Rajasthan or wind turbines in Tamil Nadu and so forth. But there's new potential for business models for distributed energy. We've worked with utilities to design utility-led business models for rooftop solar, whether it is for people who have very little credit or don't have money or don't have their own roofs, they're living in tower blocks, apartment blocks. For all of those, you can actually design business models where even the utility actually saves money and makes money in the process. On the back of all of this, we've seen this new Suryodaya Yojana that the government has launched for 10 million, 1 crore homes to get rooftop solar. That alone could lead to about 25 gigawatts of solar capacity installed. Another route of the renewables is the rural deployment of solar irrigation through different components of what is called the PM Kusum scheme, whether it is individual solar irrigation plants or standalone pumps, or even grid interactive agricultural pumps getting feeder level solar power. This is the world's largest solar irrigation program. And again, to facilitate this, at CEEW, we design district by district a decision support tool using 20 different parameters: the level of the water, groundwater, the kind of cropping pattern, the access to credit for the farmer, etc., which then gives you, depending on the shading of the blue, the darker shade means you have higher return on investment in deploying solar irrigation in those districts than elsewhere. So you can decide what type of business model. Feeder level solarization works in some places, individually owned solar pumps work better in other places. So this is, again, the scientific approach we need in order to scale up these markets that are developing. Another market that can be scaled up is using distributed renewables for rural livelihood generation enterprises. In a program that we designed called Powering Livelihoods, we've supported 12 startups so far, looking at all sorts of things from solar-based charkhas to refrigerators to paddle looms, solar-based hydroponics, food dryers, food processing, etc. We estimate that this is a $50 billion market opportunity just in rural India. And our program alone has resulted in over 12,000 technology deployments and about 20,000 livelihoods enabled in just 2 years, with 69% of the beneficiaries being women. A third route towards this, since we discussed both transport and industry, is what is going to happen on the transport side. Now, one of the things that even Indians, as at least well-heeled Indians like us, we don't realize is that the bulk of Indians in urban India, their primary mode of transport is actually their two legs. This is data coming from the country's largest urban mobility survey that we ran a few years ago. Now, in India, the push towards EVs is actually happening oriented towards this kind of pattern of mobility. It's those who have no access to motorized mobility or those who are relying on buses or two-wheelers. And hence, India has done the largest e-bus procurement of 5,000 e-buses at one go. More will happen. There's a push towards e-autos. 93% of the EV registrations are actually in that category. So this graphic that you see comes from CEEW's real-time EV mobility dashboard. And you can see, this data gets updated every couple of days. You can see 10 years ago, 2,400 EVs sold. Last financial year, 1.67 million EVs sold. And then the curve drops because we are currently going through our financial year already about 184,000 sold. So the bulk of these is actually two-wheelers, three-wheelers, buses, etc. So that's the nature of mobility change that's happening. Then we come to the industrial part of the energy transition. And India's green hydrogen mission is the second largest in the world after the EU and the US. They have 10 million tons production capacity target. Ours is 5 million tons. But you can see from that map that it's in the tropics where you get the lowest cost green hydrogen production because you manage to reduce the cost of the power coming from renewables. But there's one more dimension to this. And one more dimension to this is that even as we are figuring out our pathways for renewables, for mobility, for green hydrogen, for industry, etc., there are trade barriers that are emerging elsewhere. So this map shows you the exposure index just for iron and steel, a very critical sector, for exports to the European Union once it's carbon border adjustment mechanism becomes fully operational. Our estimation at CEEW is that about $37 billion of India's exports are at risk to sustainability-driven, non-tariff mechanisms of the European Union alone. And that goes well beyond, of course, iron and steel, includes textiles, chemicals, etc. That's on the tariff wall side. And then there is also the big subsidy play that is happening in all the three major economic regions. The Inflation Reduction Act in the US, the Green Deal Industrial Plan in the EU, and the Made in China program in China. Now, we don't have the same deep pockets, but we do have a large economy. How do we then leverage our economy and these pathways that I've been highlighting to start imagining a cleaner future for our economy and to maintain our competitiveness? So to do that, and I'm now going to run through the next 2-3 slides a little quickly, we did the first marginal abatement cost curves for heavy industry in India, for steel, for cement, for aluminium, for fertilizer, and so forth. Of course, the capex is going to be huge. The additional capex for India's steel industry, which is already the world's second largest, to move towards net zero over obviously the transition period is close to 300 billion. So obviously it's not overnight, but there's additional OPEX expenses as well. But that MAC curve, the marginal abatement cost curve, shows you that there is still technologies that we have to invest in significantly in terms of carbon capture and utilization and sequestration. It's not just going to come from energy efficiency or from RE-based generation of crude steel. But the opportunities are also tremendous. There's jobs, there's nearly 1.6 million jobs that can be created just in the hydrogen supply chain. 4 million direct jobs then get created in the green steel industry, 2x increase in steel production, and so forth. We did the same for cement. We are also the second largest cement producer in the world, and one of the most energy efficient fleets that we have. And yet, energy efficiency alone is not going to suffice. We will still need significant amount of abatement through a range of other interventions. There's energy efficiency, there's renewables, there's reduction in the clinker factor, and then, of course, there is again the carbon sequestration. We can do that for aluminium. We've done that for fertilizer. The story is the same. It's these heavy industries that are critical for our industrial base, and we have to start investing in these technologies, starting with the cheapest, the negative cost technologies now, but moving on to those trajectories now, rather than locking ourselves into a high emissions pathway. But the bulk of our industrial base is actually MSMEs, and they need to also shift towards cleaner fuels, as I was indicating earlier. This is just a photograph of an experiment we've been running in a brass cluster in Moradabad. As you know, Moradabad is the brass capital. And brass is made in these tiny makeshift workshops where brass is melting at 1200 Celsius. You can imagine in an unventilated room at 1200 Celsius to be able to work in those conditions. So our colleagues at CEEW worked with the cluster to design this furnace that you can see, which is now able to use cooking gas, LPG, instead of dirty coal, reduce emissions by upwards of 50%, and melt brass for the first time in India at 1200 Celsius. So this is an example of how we have to start thinking about innovation, not just at the large industry level, the heavy industry level, but also for the bulk of our industrial base. But the message is throughout the same. This is not just a renewable story. It's an energy transition across our economic sectors. As I conclude in the last few minutes, I know we are running a little behind time. I want to highlight two other core things. One is we've got to focus on supply chain vulnerabilities. I can come back to the data in a second. The basic point is, across the world, supply chains for clean energy are highly concentrated. India's capacity, while it's building up, say, on solar, for wind, for batteries, it's not nearly enough compared to the demand we have. So we have to invest in this. The same applies to critical minerals. 15 countries account for 55% of identified critical minerals, but even a fewer number account for 75% of the production. Our minerals estimation for, say, 6 key minerals, as you can see, our reserves are quite low compared to what our baseline demand will be. So again, creating that whole circular economy of critical minerals is going to be key to dealing with the supply chain challenges. Clean tech IP is concentrated. 5 countries account for over 80% of the patent applications and over 90% of the patents granted. So India needs to start focusing on a technology co-development modality with these key countries. Otherwise, we'll be playing catch up and miss this technology bus. And the other thing, and I'm going to conclude with in a minute, is that money is still not flowing in sufficient volume to where the sun shines the most. The bulk of clean energy investments is still going to US, EU, and China. India, while it's going up, still nowhere near what we need. We need $200 billion for the power sector alone this decade. $100 billion plus for green hydrogen this decade. It's a market of over $200 billion for electric mobility this decade. But that money has to flow in a manner that deals with the challenges, whether the grid adequacy of power, whether it's the manufacturing and supply chain localization for green hydrogen, whether it's payment security mechanism for electric mobility, and so forth. And in the process, again, we can discuss this in detail, is the simultaneous development of our carbon market, which began as an energy efficiency story with Perform, Achieve, and Trade scheme, which is now gradually moving towards the carbon credit trading scheme under the compliance market. But also there's a voluntary offset market through the carbon offset mechanism. And there's a range of different opportunities within and outside India through the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. Estimation is over $12 billion per annum Indian businesses could be earning in the process. And there's this long list of ESG standards that are evolving as a result. So as I conclude, here's the point. This graphic shows you not just energy, but the economy emissions in our model, how it'll grow, peak around 2040, and then come down to net zero. What I've articulated to you is that we've got to map our emissions pathways. We've got to start with energy efficiency, get onto renewables, push EVs, and then use green hydrogen and other technologies to start decarbonizing the really hard to abate sectors and the MSMEs. Move towards focusing on the critical supply chains for our clean energy transition, and then leverage regulation and finance to make it all happen. This is the emissions pathway. This is the growth pathway. This is the policy pathway that we have to pursue if India has to become a green superpower. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Arunabha. That's very, very enlightening. And thank you for putting it up on your website, because there's so much information there. I'm sure people would love to go back and refer to what you spoke about. I presume that chart is for net zero, right?
Yes. Yes. The last
so actually, there will still be emissions. There may be abatement and
yes.
and other measures as well. But
yes.
Arunabha, I think we have about 20 odd minutes of time.
Yeah.
So I'm going to try and keep my questions short. I do agree with you that this is a very large economic opportunity, globally. And while you were talking in the billions, I've been talking about in the trillions. That this is possibly a $70-80 trillion global opportunity till 2050 from all aspects that you've discovered. And so it is one of the most transformative business opportunities that exist, depending on whichever side of the spectrum you want to sit on. The consequences, of course, are very drastic. But what happens with this is also a recognition that there will be a lot of inflation. Inflation both in power prices, because you have additional capacity coming up while at the same time others are going down. And transitions always lead to inflation. Coupled by that with industries adopting cleaner fuel, they will pass that on to their consumers at some point. Can I ask you, what is the recognition of this both within India as well as globally in terms of the economic impact of this transition on a policy basis And is this something that you believe that government understands? And do other governments that understand it better than others?
It's a great question, Nikhil, and thanks for posing this. The short answer is I don't think there is a full understanding of the macroeconomic implications. Because the macroeconomic implication, one of them that you've highlighted is inflation. And with that, especially when you factor in the global economy, as you were referring, when there is inflation, say, through heavy spending in the United States, because of which then the Federal Reserve raises interest rates in the United States, the cost of dollar-denominated debt for Indian businesses goes up. We've done nothing. Maybe all being same here in India, something happening elsewhere then changes the equation for us. That's one aspect. The other macroeconomic consequence is also about the question on revenues, government revenues. We have to recognize that right now, a lot of our government revenues are coming from indirect taxes, often, taxes on fuels. Now, if we get rid of those fuels, that's what we need for net zero. That gives us economic opportunity, investment opportunity, but government runs out of money. So how do we start taxing other sources in order to be able to deal with this issue? A third macroeconomic consequence, Nikhil, is jobs. And we've been doing this, say, in automobiles is such a major component of our industrial sector, if you look at the long ancillary chain. So there will be some job losses in the ICE automobile sector, and there'll be job gains in the EV jobs that we are estimating. It might even be net job loss by a margin, but there will be job gains in other types of technologies that have not yet emerged at all, say circular economy of minerals and battery recycling. So I think what the bigger point that you're highlighting is that we need to now, once we start understanding that the sustainability is not just a tree-hugging agenda, that it is part of the economy, then in a very rational way, whether you're as a business person or as a policymaker, we start looking at the macroeconomic consequences as well, whether it's inflation, debt, public debt, private debt, trade, investment flows, jobs, and so forth.
Thank you for that. No, I completely agree that given the economic impact and the necessity for us to do it, that we need to have an economic view towards this and tie that in together. But when you presented your pizza pie, which you said was half eaten, I did notice that one of the segments, which was stratospheric ozone depletion, has performed very well. And so I would imagine that post the Montreal Protocol, we've done great work in terms of ozone, reducing ozone emission. But at the same time, I believe that the Kigali Protocol now looks for limitation in terms of HCFCs, etc. And I don't know if it's completely correct, but possibly you're the best person to answer this, that natural gases have a higher global warming potential than carbon dioxide. But at the same time, we're looking to gasify our economy. And you have other parts of the world which are gas rich, which seem to say that coal is a far dirtier fuel. Could you put this in context globally, how it stands? And in India, why are we pushing gas when we have a net zero mission? I understand the need for us to uplift people's lives and livelihoods. And so for cooking gas and LPG, it's of course far better because it's more convenient. Your insights into this would be very
super question, Nikhil. This goes back to the a point you made right at the outset, Nikhil, of many different ministries dealing with energy, right? And when we look at it overall, we see that the role of gas, say, in the power sector is very limited, particularly because we are importing most of our gas, right? And even the existing gas-based power capacity is actually running on very low plant load factors. There is a role for natural gas in the industrial sector, but we have to first ask ourselves in which sectors is it needed? Can, say, many of the small industries that are 40% of our exports actually leapfrog straight to electrification. Right now, they might be burning kerosene, right, or rubber oil, some of the dirtiest fuels. So moving to gas, of course, reduces the emissions on a life cycle basis. But methane, you're absolutely right, is a far more potent a greenhouse gas compared to carbon dioxide, which is why globally there is now something called the Global Methane Pledge, where at least developed countries are trying to push down the story. I think for India, some of the transition, say in steel, we will not be able to overnight shift to green hydrogen-based steel. But blending small amounts of green hydrogen into natural gas-based steel manufacturing rather than coal-based steel manufacturing not only brings down the cost of the delta between the cleaner steel and the dirty steel to something close to parity, it also creates an opportunity to, or kicks off the transition towards green hydrogen. So we see natural gas in specific sectors as having a role, and that too as a transition fuel, but only on the assumption, as you rightly pointed out at the outset, that we have a comprehensive energy and emissions transition trajectory that we have planned out, and we're quickly moving towards that.
Thank you for that. My issue with government and governments in general has been that they tend to look at policies for very short term, and really they don't look at the outcome which they want. And it requires truly visionary leadership to be able to orient people around that. So hopefully we'd be able to get our act together.
One way to do this, because governments come and go also, right? And this is a multi-decadal transition at the end of the day. I mean, Nikhil, you and I will be pretty old by the time we get to net zero. My daughter will be retiring when we get to net zero. So what we need, Nikhil, is the regulatory clarity. That's what businesses need, right? So whether it's in the form of a carbon price, and it doesn't have to be $100 carbon price today. It can be a ratcheting up carbon price, but businesses know that every 3 years, 5 years, the carbon price will go up, right? There is clarity, there's legislative clarity of the direction of travel. Those then give you the confidence to invest. I mean, today, if you're an automobile company, are you going to build one more assembly line for an IC engine? Or are you going to start building an assembly line for an electric vehicle? Because we know where the future is. It's just a question of how long we are going to wait. And our waiting period is linked to the uncertainty associated sometimes with policy. So it's not just government announcements. I think the legislative backing, the regulatory backing, the price backing is necessary for businesses to make those investment decisions.
Thank you for that, Arunabha. We're live streaming on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube as well, and we have several hundred people joining us on that. I want to move on to some questions that are being asked by some of the participants here. And you've touched upon this, but the question comes from a gentleman, which I thought, Som Dua. And the question is, how can we make climate remedial measures as opportunities for entrepreneurship for upcoming youth? New ideas with innovative approach supported by mentoring will motivate youth for entrepreneurship, for inclusive growth, prosperity, and sustainability. We need to have a collaborative approach. Could you talk about, well, maybe jobs in the abatement sector, but in general, what do you believe that the economy needs? And where are the employment opportunities in the space of sustainability?
So again, this is at the heart of it. We are the world's most populous country, so we cannot ignore, and we are a growing population still. We cannot ignore the imperative of jobs. But this is where the green economy actually offers a far greater employment coefficient than a fossil-based economy. Say rooftop solar creates 7 times more jobs than even utility-scale solar. Utility-scale solar creates more jobs than gas. Gas creates more jobs than coal. But when we start looking at it, not just as electricity, when we think about the range of different aspects that you get from this cleaner economy, there is not just energy, there is the bioeconomy, There's the nature-based economy. Just some examples I'll give. We can have uh, we can have green hydrogen, microgrids, EV manufacturing, rooftop solar, floating solar, pumped hydro. Then you have a circular economy around plastic waste, e-waste, construction demolition waste, battery waste. You have a bioeconomy and nature-based economy on sustainable tourism, bio-based packaging, mangrove management, etc., etc. So I'm not just cooking this up. Our colleagues have been working in Odisha, just estimating, just for one state, we estimate that over 10 lakh jobs can be created. This is more than 10% of the entire jobs in the state. Just that one state could attract about 700 lakh crore of investment in this new paradigm of a green economy. So this is how we have to start rethinking and leapfrogging towards a very different economic paradigm, which is not about limiting growth, but about promoting new growth vectors.
Thanks for that, Arunabha. Yes, I mean, we need to create new jobs, and this is a new area, a new domain which requires new competencies. So hopefully there will be enough courses to train people in this space, to let them know how they can make the best of the opportunity. But you did touch upon funding through this entire conversation. And there's a comment from Neeraj Srivastava here. Is India in a position to bear the financial burden of transition? It's massive. Developed world is more interested in geopolitics. I know that you've spoken in international platforms as well. What is the view internationally for developing countries like India in terms of funding its transition? What is the government of India's view, and what do you think is CEW's view?
Well, CEW's view is that we have, our research indicates that in 2020 prices, our net zero transition will require $10.1 trillion for just three sectors, power, mobility, and say green hydrogen. So that's 2020 prices. That boils down to an average of about $200 billion a year over a 50-year period. That's not unaffordable. The question is, are you getting access to the capital at the right cost of capital? That is the decision here. Now, this is where the issue becomes a little challenging. We estimate that our financial sector can cover a bulk of this from domestic resources, but we'll still have a $3.5 trillion gap, which has to come from overseas. That overseas capital, when it's denominated in dollars, etc., then gets hedged. And that hedging for currency increases the cost of capital. The hedging against policy risk or political risk increases the cost of capital. Now, there is a big problem, and this now we shift towards what you're saying about what the international platforms. One of the points that India made through its G20 presidency, very rightly so, we've done some work on this, many others have done as well, is that this perception of risk of investing in emerging markets, while there is risk, there is a big delta between the real risk and the perceived risk. And we now need the multilateral financial institutions, the World Banks of the world, etc., to not just give project financing, but to underwrite portfolios of investment, to underwrite these non-project macroeconomic risks so that individual businesses, individual investors are not burdened by that huge cost of capital. This is the significant reform that the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group, the G20's expert group that was led by N.K. Singh and Larry Summers, etc., have proposed of how do you start reforming these institutions so that they start becoming more fit for purpose for investing in emerging markets where the growth is, where the energy demand is rising, but where the cost of capital is still way too high.
Well, thank you for that, Arunabha. You know, we're coming to the end of this 1 hour session that we had with you. I know we started a little late as well, but while I will share the questions that and the comments that all the participants have for you, I wanted to end with what are your hopes and your fears, and obviously the fact is that you have it as of today. because information, and this is a very fast-changing landscape in this space. So I want to ask you, Arunabha, as someone who has a deep amount of knowledge, who's spent a long time working in this space, who's founded one of the foremost think tanks. What is the hope, and what gives you hope in this space? But also at the same time, what gives you concern? What are you concerned about?
I'll start with the concern. Right, Nikhil, we all live in a world of uncertainty, right? But my concern is that even under uncertainty, we are not comfortable with non-linearity. We are not comfortable. We've been trained, we've been conditioned since we were kids, since we went to school. You know, economies grow, agriculture, industry, services. That's not India's pattern of growth. We've been conditioned economies grow from low income to middle income to high income. That's not what's happening in many parts of the world. We've got a middle income trap happening. We've been conditioned into thinking that, yeah, it'll be, economic growth rate will be 6% or 7%, etc. But that's the range. We've not been conditioned into thinking that there can be a pandemic. Now we are faced with the climate crisis, not with a 1 year or 2 year pandemic. We are faced with a multi-decadal asteroid coming up and hitting us. That can completely disrupt our economic growth assumptions. And we are not conditioned to being comfortable with that non-linearity. But on the back of it, and that's my hope, is that on the back of it, non-linearity is also where disruption happens in technology, in business models, in financial models, and so forth. And just the last 14 years that we've been around, it's been such an exciting journey to watch India change from nothing in renewables to the 4th largest, from nothing in green hydrogen to at least having the 2nd largest mission in the world, from nothing 10 years ago to selling 1.67 million. Yes, we are not selling Teslas, but we're selling the kind of mobility solution that will also matter in Southeast Asia, that will also matter in Sub-Saharan Africa. So that is the kind of non-linear disruption we need in our policy, in our technology, in our finance, and in our own behaviors. That's when we will begin to show a pathway to development that no one before us has actually demonstrated, because they followed that linear journey and then taught to us in our textbooks. We got to rewrite the textbooks.
Thank you for your inspirational words. I think that there is a task ahead of us. We all have to be part of it. We will be part of the change, but there are ample opportunities as well. So for a lot of the MBA students who are joining us here today, I think that they will find immense opportunity in this space. We at AIMA ourselves have taken on sustainability as a key mission and provide a lot of certification courses. We were thinking about doing a sustainability MBA as opposed to an MBA with a specialization in sustainability, but we'll see how that ends up. But ladies and gentlemen, I know that your screens are muted, but do join me in thanking Dr. Arunabha Ghosh for his very insightful speech. Thank you, Arunabha, and we look forward to engaging more with you and with CEEW and with AIMA.
Thank you again, Nikhil, to you and AIMA for inviting me. Thanks for the really stimulating questions. And please do share the questions with me, and I'd welcome anyone who has joined to reach out to us at CEEW, and we'd be happy to answer anything that we haven't managed.
Thank you again, Arunabha. Thank you, Rekha.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Ghosh. And thank you, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. The video will be on YouTube, and any questions you might have, you might want to send to us. We can share them with Dr. Ghosh. Thank you once again. Have a good day.